I'm Jennifer Egan. This is just wonderful. I'm happy so many people are here, and we have a day. You have the agenda in front of you. Of really, it's a culmination of a couple years of work on my end and Jen Nelson's end. And I want to thank Tom also, because we kind of roped him back in, and he was just gracious enough to share this space and also show us his land later on today. So those of you that don't know Tom, I met Tom a long time ago and toured wetlands and different projects that he had worked on, and was just really amazed at the types of projects he did and how he worked with landowners. So that was when I was working in the nonprofit sector. And now I work at the University of Maryland Environmental Finance Center. And part of what I do is work with other conservation organizations like the Nature Conservancy. So this today is part of a grant with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and TNC to really build capacity. It's a capacity grant. And what we understood with the Sussex Conservation District and DNREC and even NRCS, the coordination and the communication between the different entities could use some capacity building, especially when it in respect to wetlands. And so NIFWF, of course, part of this grant is the interest in improving water in the Chesapeake Bay and doing projects specifically in the Chesapeake Bay drainage. But I have Delmarva in here because then we roped in Chase Colmorgen, which you'll hear from in a minute, that is also interested in wetland restoration, specifically for black duck habitat. So this grant has, I felt, really helped help me talk, Jen Nelson talk, bringing in Chase to this common denominator of water quality, habitat, and how do we rebuild wetlands in Delmarva. So, like I mentioned, it's a capacity grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and we've really have multiple partners that are shown down here that we've been working with for a couple of years. So introduction-wise, I know we have, who do we have in the room? Conservation District, mostly over here. Okay. And DNREC, or who's over here? District, okay. DNREC, okay, great. And NRCS, okay. So perfect. And then who else?
We're from Shore Rivers.
Shore Rivers, okay. So, and I know Jen invited you. What you are working on different aspects of what we're going to talk about today as well. So I just kind of wanted to get a sense of, from the different groups, what do you hope to learn today?
Just a little bit of everything about wetland planning and trying to get everybody's points of views from start to finish.
Great.
Anything I can learn.
Great, yeah. Thank you. What about DNREC? What are you thinking?
So we obviously have the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Implementation Plan. And we have a really high wetland enhancement, restoration, and creation goal. And we have grant funding to support that. So after Tom left, and then we lost Dale Churchy and Lyle Jones, a few of those people that have had decades and decades of knowledge and that implemented a lot of these projects, once they left, we realized there was a huge gap in filling these goals that we have. So I'm here to offer and say that we have grant funding available for these sorts of projects and maybe come up with some new ones. I just see kind of the direction that we're going with implementing some of these projects, and if there's opportunities, and just wanting to hear the conversation. So.
Right, perfect.
So Claire's here with me. She helps with that process too.
Great, okay, so Claire and Brittany. What about SCD? Because you were told to come, or you want to have a day in the field because it's better than a day in the office, or?
More basic knowledge of the whole wetland.
Basic knowledge. Okay, good. And that is exactly what we were thinking. Sort of, you have your task of going and working with landowners, but how do we kind of expand that task to other goals if it fits for the landowner? So we have Grant DaCosta that will speak as well. He's in the back. He's somebody that I've worked with as well that works with landowners, and we brought him in to kind of share some of his stories. So what about NRCS?
I think like we've seen wetland restoration projects in Sussex County where we work, and I'd like just be interested to learn like what went into the planning process and how did they decide what to do there and what would be beneficial.
Perfect. Okay, great. Yes. So, and that is exactly how we've planned this day. I'm going to quickly run through some things kind of going higher level because I teach at the University of Delaware. I teach natural resource economics and also sustainable development. And part of what I like to share with my students is the idea that our uses of water resources has changed over time. And really this partnership and what we're doing today is kind of getting back to that restoration goal where we use land for one purpose, for economic development and benefit, but then we start to have realized the science of ecology and how systems are connected, that we need to restore some of those systems. Again, I have an environmental economics background as well, and it only makes sense in certain circumstances. For example, landowners are obviously still interested in producing the crops that they need to produce, but then there's certain marginal areas that we'll talk about today, like what do we do with those marginal areas that aren't producing? And that's where wetlands can come in, especially with funding. I like to talk about mill dams because that's a really good example of building the economy and developing water resources specifically for economic development and human growth and city growth. But over time, as you, I'm sure, are aware, a lot of dams are being removed. So it's the same type of thing with wetlands where we paved over, we covered over wetlands, and now we're trying to put them back in places, hopefully where they were previously, or potentially with water level changes, create wetlands. So I just like to show this. This is a pretty large dam remover, the Elwha, and it's restoring this stream. But then you also have different things that happen, of course, to the river that all the sediment comes down and you have a lot of change over time. But it basically comes down to the idea that it's economically beneficial to remove dams in certain circumstances. Same thing with wetlands. If a lot of you are maybe familiar with wetland ecology or maybe not, today you'll be more familiar with how wetlands have certain functions that we now know scientifically are beneficial to humans, and that if we don't restore wetlands, that we end up paying on the back end sometimes. Maybe with drinking water, we have to increase drinking water costs. Certainly with our inland bays and the Chesapeake Bay, we now know that changing land use removes some of the ability of contaminants and sediments to be filtered. We know that there's habitat, critical habitat that, again, Chase is interested in with the black duck. So there's funding that's going towards this to restore wetlands. Part of what I did for my consulting career was I delineated wetlands, and it was just really interesting to always think about the three different components. You have to have vegetation, soils, and hydrology. Hydrology is something you'll learn about today in the afternoon, like how to think about like the wet soils and how do you get them maybe wetter. And then you also want those plants to come in that like the wet area. And then the soils change over time too. So a lot of you probably have good soils background. I also have an undergraduate in geology, so that was where I like the dirt part, and seeing like the glade soils are indicative of wetlands. So these types of things are what you're trying to create when you're building a wetland. There's different names and different functions of wetlands. One of my stories I like to tell is working with a landowner that was in violation for filling a wetland. And he said, my tractor didn't get stuck, it can't be a wetland. So that was his definition of what a wetland would be like. If his tractor gets stuck, it was a wetland. I said, well, sorry, by definition of the Army Corps of Engineers, this is a wetland. But this is just to show that there's different functions, different brackish wetlands, freshwater wetlands. And one of the things that I like to share with my students as well, going back to economic development and how people thought of wetlands, you know, wetlands were changed for different reasons. In cities, they were paved over because they thought that they were just for vector-borne diseases like malaria. So they covered over all the wetlands because they thought that would help with malaria. But they realized that there's different things that the mosquitoes could breed in like teeny tiny puddles. So paving over the wetlands actually removed the things that ate the mosquitoes. But it was also a sign of prosperity to just kind of control nature, basically, for human progress. So as you may also know, Delaware has lost in excess of 50% of its wetland acreage since European settlement. So again, that's what today is about. How do we identify areas that it'll be beneficial, again, for the landowner and for water quality to restore them? Another thing you may have heard about that I deal a lot with as well is ecosystem services, and really quantifying those ecosystem services. And that is where on that back end, what marshes and all of these natural areas provide to humans. Again, we now know that if we protect those dune areas, we protect salt marshes, that they actually attenuate some of these storms that we're seeing coming in as well. So in the Environmental Finance Center, that's what we do. That's part of what I handle, is like that back end. How do we quantify that monetary benefit of restoring these systems? And this just talks about, like, globally, there's a total economic value associated with different types of natural systems that, again, is valued in the economics of natural resources. So this is really important too. Those of you that work with landowners, this is really about how do you talk with landowners, what types of tools can you use, and that's where Tom was really good. Understood how to talk with landowners, because most of these areas that we would like to look at restoration or enhancement for wetlands, or potentially water control structures, which you'll learn about today too, it's on private land. So the majority of areas that have the potential for restoration, we need to be able to connect and communicate with the landowners. So one of the things that we were thinking would be beneficial is Chase Colmorgen. You gonna come in? So Chase is going to review some things that the way he thinks about wetlands. And can you please just, like, talk about what you do as well with Ducks Unlimited?
Sure.
Thanks.
Basically, I'm working at part of the Working Lands for Wildlife program for NRCS, which is identifying specific targeted species of concern around the whole country. The American black duck was identified in 2017 as a species of concern across Delmarva as well as New Jersey. Specifically, I work in Delaware, Eastern Shore, Maryland, and Eastern Shore, Virginia, trying to find more black duck habitat, whether that means wetland restoration, wetland enhancement, wetland creation, using NRCS practices and programs. So what I really just wanted to go over with you briefly today was, so when I'm going out, or I get initial contact from a landowner, they have interest in doing a wetland on their property. They might have a wet spot in their field, and they want to know if it's, applicable or feasible to put a wetland there. So this is kind of what I would go through for GIS to kind of see what their property looks like. So initially, this is actually Tom's property. So what I would do is basically just draw in GIS, draw a polygon around the whole property just to get an idea of where I'm at, get an acreage amount, and just get an idea of what the whole property looks like. From there, you go in and check your soils. This is kind of a natural printout that I would have that I would bring with me to a site visit, which would encompass all the different types of soils, make it partially transparent so I can see, where the ditches are, where potential areas that he might be wanting to work in are. And so then I can also look through the soils, and determine which ones are hydric, which ones are most likely gonna be best for wetlands. Next, I have LiDAR, which most NRCS folks have access to. I'm not as familiar for DNREC. I'm sure that you potentially could. Basically, what you're looking at here, I like to use the more colored color ramps here for landowners. It kind of shows your highs and lows a little bit easier than a grayscale map. You can very clearly see the definition in the ditching here and throughout here, as well as he does have existing low spots on the property, which you can see these two triangles here, and up towards this area. This shows some areas that are definitely lower than others. And from there, I would be able to target these areas and say, all right, from what I can tell going back, all right, these soils, this is Hurlock right here, and this is a low area, so this is a good spot for a wetland. And then we can move forward. And essentially what I would do then is draw polygons over the areas that I think are going to be best for wetlands, and then move forward and say, all right, this is where we want to work. Is this an area that you're thinking about doing? Is it not? And then we can move forward with, potentially planning a project. So this is more for my benefit, but I just wanted to show the difference between the two different color ramps of LiDAR. This kind of shows more definition of low areas in the grayscale. It's not as pretty, but it'll basically show, these two low areas. Again, you can see, and most likely either holding water or they're just extremely low. Same with all the ditching through here that's much more pronounced on the grayscale than it was on the color ramps. So lastly, I would end up with a whole bunch of contours, which I know this looks crazy on here. Basically everything's labeled, but it'll essentially help me determine which way the land's moving, which way we can, anticipate water moving, whether for water control structure, for outlets, or, basically what we can do for different areas. So this is just an example. I zoomed in on Tom's backfield here, these two little wetlands that are already in existence, but assuming that they were just wet marginal areas of a field, what we could do there. This would be your first map where you'd be looking at a specific area. Again, look at your soils where, the blue would be Hurlock going through here, and this would be more of a spot that you would want to focus on, rather than in the center here, which is Woodstown, which is more of a sandier upland soil. So focusing in this area here, knowing that this is primarily where you'd want your wetland to be, potentially out here as well, but it's more wooded. Then looking back into your LiDAR, you can especially see here, with, obviously I know there are already existing wetlands, but with this having been a normal farmed field, this could have been a lower area with woods up against it, and you'd be able to see that clearly that this is the area you want to work in, and this is how you want to move forward with where you want to put your site. Again, different color ramp kind of shows the same thing. And then finally, you can see the contours a little bit better here. You can kind of see how the water's moving in and out, where the high spot of the field is, as well as how water would be moving towards this existing ditch that goes through the woods here. So I think, yep, that's about all I have for that one. So I mean, the main thing is, identifying an area that you can potentially find it using GIS prior to even going out to a site visit. So there's a lot of times where I have landowners that call me and they're like, is this even applicable site? It might be quicker. I have a soils layer on Google Earth as well, where you can just pull it up on Google Earth and click on a soil type and say, yes, this looks like it's hydric, it'll be wet. Now you still should follow up with a site visit, because there's a lot of times where some of the soil maps might be slightly off, or there might be an inclusion where, there was a hydric soil that is built into a not normally wet soil that actually created a wet spot in a field that you could potentially move forward with creating a wetland on. But moral of the story is, you have a lot of resources through GIS and mapping prior to actually going out to do a site visit, and it's very valuable. This is just the way I do it. Other people, you might want to try it differently, but this is what I've found that works best for me before going out to visit with the landowner. So, yep.
Are you familiar with the Delaware Watershed Resource Registry?
Yes.
Okay, just put a plug out there for everyone.
I had slides in here for that.
Did you? Okay, I won't say anything else.
It's in the other presentation that didn't get loaded.
Okay.
Because I had this area to just show what it looked
Yeah,
like.
it's a great tool for what
Yeah.
you're saying to do, for especially people that aren't familiar with GIS. It's all there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Just play around with.
Yes, I did have slides. And then, so we also wanted to mention, in working with Allison Rogerson, that there's layers that we think will be available potentially. She said they're not available yet. But this map, if you can't really see it, but it maps the river and the rivers or tributaries, and then adjacent hydric areas or potentially marginal areas as well. So that's another resource that's being produced, that's available, but it's not out in public yet.
In QA/QC now.
There we go.
Seeing some issues,
Perfect.
so we have to go back and get them to fix some of it, but eventually.
Okay.
soon.
Yeah, she gave us this example and showed where the data came from. So that's another resource that we wanted to point out. In addition to the WRR, which I can show later if we want to, but it's multi-state in the mid-Atlantic, and it'll give you property boundaries. It gives you areas where you can have riparian restoration, wetland protection. So it kind of is identifying all these areas again before you go out in the field. You can get a sense of what's going on before you set foot on the property. Thank you, Chase.
Yep.
And I think that's great to just overview and what to do before you go out. What we want to do is we're part of this grant is to compile resources from today and different things that are needed for you guys to do what you do when you go out in the field. So we're starting, there's already great resources from DNREC, but then there's going to be funding. Part of what we want to also compile is make sure we have current funding, so you kind of know how to talk to the farmer about funding options. So here's some listed right now. We're going to watch a video, but real quick, logistically, there is a restroom right out here if you need that. Part of what we wanted to do is connect with some of the landowners that had done projects previously. So we still want to potentially do that, but Jamie connected us with the Nathan Hudson, who is doing amazing work on his property. And in addition, there's this short video that really just kind of talks about, it's Nathan himself, and he talks about what he's done on his land. It's over 400 acres of restoration when he's all said and done. So, yep, go ahead. Yeah, yep. Yeah, and so this was cropland. It was marginal cropland. He realized it wasn't producing, and he just said it made sense to convert it. So it's mostly he has it for recreation and for his family to hunt and camp and hike on. But basically, yep, go ahead.
My name is Nathan Hudson. I live in Laurel, Delaware. We're sitting at what we call the Pepperbox Farm, and it's a farm that my parents purchased in 1957, and we developed this farmland into a wetland restoration. My mother in particular wanted to reestablish some wetlands for our wildlife habitat and leave it as a legacy. I was familiar with the NRCS programs, and I worked with them to help develop this project. I was looking for a place that I could take my grandchildren to see that red-winged blackbird that's sitting back there, to go look at ducks, to go look at deer, and enjoy it recreationally. And it will be wetlands forever.
My name is Scott Hudson. I am Nathan's son. I'm the future of this place, I guess. That's the best way to describe it. I was glad to help my father go through the process with the NRCS. Everything was relatively painless.
Right there. The technical advice from the NRCS, the soil work that they do, I have no knowledge of, and I trust them 100% on that. I rely completely on the NRCS's expertise. And our second site, we're in the process right now of establishing that back into permanent wildlife habitat. It will look very much like this. Waters run through here, it filters the waters, it traps the sediment, and the habitat is excellent.
Who's making that noise?
That's a frog. That's a frog. Actually, there's several frogs out there.